I feel very called to become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-800-585-9396. That's 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
A tremendous Friday to each and every one of you. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your Friday to join us here on EWTN's Open Line. A special mailbag edition today. Colin Donovan, our Vice President of Theology, is in the house. And Colin and I are at the Birmingham Jefferson Convention Complex right now as we speak, getting everything ready for the family celebration this weekend.
That's right. And I'm the only one that's bilocating of the two of us.
So, you know, that's just a testimony to your holiness, Colin. There's no question about that. As you're donned and head to toe in scapulars, I understand how this works. 1-800, well, I'm not even going to give out the phone number. We do have a couple callers held over from a previous program, but we won't be taking your phone calls today. We will be answering your emails. But Colin is in the house. We won't be taking text messages today. I'm just completely off my game here all of a sudden because we're doing things a little bit differently.
That's right.
You know, we had Theology Roundtable last week, so it's been 2 weeks since we've actually done this program with you. I've told you before, you generally sit in the chair that I sit in when you do the television show. And
That's true.
And this chair is labeled Talent Left. And I've often told you that I'm just not sure you're talent left material.
I don't wish to be left anything, actually.
Left behind? No?
Well, that either.
That's a whole other show.
Yeah, that would be another show. We can do that one on the last thing sometime.
We got a couple gracious callers that have hung on the line. Tony is in San Antonio, Texas. He's listening to EWTN on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Tony, thanks for holding on. You're on with Colin Donovan.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. How are you?
Oh, pretty good, Tony. What's your question?
Well, I'm a fourth-generation Mexican-American, born and raised here in South Texas. De facto language growing up was Spanish, but we're Americans. With the current presidential election, but I'm also a Catholic, 100%. I go to Mass, I adhere to all the sacraments and everything. Now, trying with the presidential election in regards to, some of the rhetoric about immigration, and you hear about anti-immigration and not mentioning anything at all party-wise, but how, knowing the stance as we as faithful Catholics are in regards to pro-life, doesn't the pro-life issue supersede all other issues in regards to the way we should form our conscience in regards to this upcoming election?
I wouldn't put it that way, but I think you're heading in the right direction with the way you phrased it. It amounts to this. As Cardinal Ratzinger and others, if you look in the moral tradition, my training is moral theology, so I'm familiar with the tradition as it existed before Vatican II, well into the past and all of that. In the tradition, we are called to have the greatest attentiveness to the common good of morality and liberty. And this is primarily going to be religious liberty, I think, because religious liberty is what is the air that the founders of our country breathed in. Many of them came here from different traditions. There were one or two Catholics among them, but many of the Puritans, Congregationalists, Anglicans, and others who wished, not to adhere to the state religion of some European country. They came here to exercise religion freely. And clearly religious liberty is a key issue. When you get into and freedom in general, the church favors that the person has the freedom that God gave us, although the state can exercise the civil function of restraining evil by making laws against things which are evil. It doesn't have to make laws against everything that's evil, but clearly to order society, it does make laws in the same areas that the moral law says, thou shalt not kill. And when there is killing, there are ways to, justified killing and unjustified killing, and so on. In the area of morality, in terms of the candidates, The church is clear that there are those issues which are more central and those that are more peripheral. Now, the central issues involve the intrinsic evils. The idea of an intrinsic evil was a big theological debate in the 70s and 80s. I was in Rome in the 80s when Pope John Paul II was working on and then later issued Veritatis Splendor, and there were, of course, advisors who were even professors at the Angelicum and that, or at least had input to that. And the whole nature of it was whether there can be this idea of proportionalism and consequentialism, and that is, nothing is really intrinsically evil in itself, but you weigh up the values that are associated with it, and you come to a conclusion that, okay, let's say, in this circumstance, abortion would be wrong. It's trivial. It's for one's convenience. In this circumstance, it would be justified. Now, the church already says an indirect abortion where the intention is not to kill, but that is an evil effect of a good thing that is done, such as removing a cancerous uterus. The tradition already has said that's fine. But direct abortion, no. And John Paul clearly clarified, especially in the face of German and American theologians, the idea that there are intrinsic evils, they are indefensible. Among them, of course, is abortion, which he later wrote Evangelium Vitae, an encyclical on, in order to express the tradition that the fifth commandment of murdering the innocent was definitive, that the murder of the unborn and the murder of the elderly, euthanasia, that all of these were evils and could never, under any circumstances, be justified. That means they're intrinsically evils. This puts abortion and the issue of life, upon which the exercise of all other rights depend, front and central among the moral issues that we should consider in considering a candidate. This is not a judgment of the right. This is not a political judgment. This is a judgment based on the logic of where life stands among values and what the church has said about intrinsic evils. That would apply to euthanasia. That would apply to in vitro fertilization, to embryonic stem cell research, and anything which treats callously and indifferently human life. So I think a candidate's positions on these issues, a candidate that favors the toleration, most will not say they favor abortion, but when people want to give more money to Planned Parenthood and other groups, you wonder, they're favoring abortion. There's no way you can get around that. But let's just say they would tolerate abortion. Would you tolerate racism? Would you tolerate the gulags and the concentration camps? Of course you wouldn't. And that's simply the logic of the pro-life movement, I think, here. So when you're looking at the issues like life issues, and then what is now after life? Forming a society. A society is formed by marriage. Marriage is dedicated to the one thing that can build up society, children. Marriage and children go together. The capacity to have children is part of marriage. If people are childless due to age or some medical condition, that doesn't affect that they have an intrinsic capacity, whether there's faults in it that prevent them from having children. Marriage is about children, about building up a society. It's in the state's interest to do so. Therefore, the true and proper understanding of marriage and human sexuality is next to life at the heart of the moral issues and has to be considered as such. And then we already mentioned religious liberty as sort of in another category. If we don't have the freedom to teach this and spread the Gospels, it's a direct attack on Christ, on the church, and on God's will that all men be free in the true sense of freedom and not slaves to the passions. So I would put as the big three: religious liberty, intrinsically evil things such as abortion and marriage, and there are a lot of other things. You could make a list of those things regarding intrinsic evils. The Pope has said gender ideology is evil, the idea that, everybody just basically gets to decide what kind of a human being they are, that there's no natural law standard. It's just my choice, my feelings. I'm a girl in the morning and a boy in the afternoon. This is not only doesn't make sense and it flies in the face of common sense, it's contrary to the natural law, and the Pope has even says it's demonic because it's attacking at the very heart of every society. The first society being the family, then you talk about the city, the state, the nation, and the world. Without the family, you don't have a city, a state, a nation, and the world. You don't have a church because it's made up of people, and people come from people, not from laboratories or from scientific technology and technological experimentation. So those issues are essential to understanding the proper ordering and functioning of any community, political, economic, familial, whatever it is. Those are essential. Now, there are lots of other issues Catholics ought to be interested. We must be interested in immigration. We must be integration in a just wage. The church has taught for decades, and the idea of a family wage, so that ideas that mothers can stay home, for example, and raise a family and not be burdened by lack of wages on the part of the working spouse, or in some cases maybe the father is the one who has to stay home for reasons. Whatever it is, the working spouse and the spouse who stays to raise the children, the state should foster that, not fight against it if there's some kind of an anomaly and every woman or every man working in the workplace is an absolute necessity. Only if economy is the basis of your society. If human beings are the basis of your society, what the couple, what the children need, that's what is more important than, everybody has to be contributing, everyone. This is the wrong idea of man. So there are issues to be understood there. In immigration, there is a balance to be sought between the rights of a country to set its borders, as the bishops have done a very good job in the 5 points they published in 2013 on this, in the balance of here, the right to set the borders, but also the obligation of hospitality to those who manage to get here, even illegally. And with all of that, there should be humane and obviously charitable things, attitude and laws and practices. But as a point of fact, this is a policy issue between the two spectrums of, let's abuse all the immigrants. To me, that would be xenophobia, not what is being talked about in the press, or Islamophobia or whatever. No, if you say in se and per se, as the theologians would say, immigrants are not to be accepted, Muslims are not to be accepted, this group or that group are not to be accepted. Yes. That would not make sense. That's an extreme. On the other hand, if you say, come one, come all, if you just get, we'll bring you over here and we'll bring you over here in unlimited numbers, that's an extreme. There's some policy middle there, and it's a policy to be worked out by the politicians, obviously with consultation of the people who elected them. But you can't make that an essential issue. It's not essential in the same way as the liberty and the moral issues. Those are essential. So Catholics need to consider them, but they are not at the core and the heart of man and society. They're very important. So pro-life in a broad sense in which it's been used, you could say yes, it means hospitality to treat the immigrant, legal or otherwise, well, and to make discrimination and judgments regarding whether under what guise they can remain or have to leave. But these are things that is the state's right to do and should be done humanely and proceeded methodically. But those are policy things that can be worked out. Also with wages, also with other economic things, also with health care. The church favors universal health care at the basic levels, but it doesn't favor necessarily government providing that. So it's all, again, a policy matter. How do you get there? And people can have different opinions, even polar opinions, and not necessarily be wrong. So, Tony, you're quite right. Abortion is key. Marriage is key. The other intrinsic evils, which we may not ever embrace or tolerate, are key. And then there are the issues which are more related to policy and a balancing of rights and prudential judgments regarding how we should proceed in bringing about the good result that we wish to bring about. So it's complicated, but there is an essential core that has to be at the forefront.
Next up is Mike in the great state of Pennsylvania, listening to EWTN on Sirius XM Channel 130. Mike, what's your question for Colin Donovan?
Hi. We were reading wife and I were reading the gospel this morning, and in John 3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, "No one has gone to heaven except he who has come down from heaven."
Mm-hmm.
And I went to the passage where I think it was Elijah and Moses appeared with the transfigured Christ to James, John, and Andrew, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Peter, James, and John.
So if Elijah and Moses appeared, yet they weren't in heaven, what was their spiritual state?
Right.
And the second part of that is Ezekiel, if I'm not mistaken, was ferreted away to heaven without dying on a chariot of fire. So how do you justify both passages?
Okay. A number of distinctions have been used over the centuries from the time of the fathers up to the present. The basic distinction is that heaven, in the strict sense of admission to the beatific vision, is something that could only be experienced once Christ had opened heaven so that the just could come in. Now, the just were not in a place of eternal punishment. Abraham and all those who believed, and Thomas Aquinas makes clear that justice given out under the Old Covenant, or even before that, you can think of the righteous line of Adam and the patriarchs down to Abraham, and then finally the Mosaic revelation of the Mosaic Code and all of that. That justice is given in virtue of Christ. Even though they did not know the name of Christ, they didn't know what God would do with, in becoming man. They didn't know that, but it was in virtue of Christ. In some way, it's parallel to what Pope Pius IX said regarding the Immaculate Conception, in virtue of the merits of Christ. So even Abraham was justified in virtue of the merits of Christ, and Adam and Eve had justice restored to them. They're cataloged as saints in the martyrology by virtue of the merits of Christ. They didn't do it on their own merits. And they were not in heaven after they died, nor was St. Joseph, the foster father of the Lord. So in the early church, they spoke of the limbo of the patriarchs. In other words, where the just went. We get a glimpse of it a little bit in that passage in Luke where Christ tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man dies and he goes to the place of punishment, and he's seeing across the chasm Lazarus, the poor man, and have him bring me a drop of water. And the Lord said, there's a chasm between you. They were not in heaven. They were in this other state, waiting for heaven to be opened by Christ himself, and to, as one of the Psalms state, to go in and with a train, like the Roman emperor did with all the things, all the captives and tribute in that, ascending into heaven. This is what our Lord did. So Moses and whoever else appeared there on the Mount of Transfiguration, they appeared from that place. And so they had some, the marks of glory were primarily Christ, that light radiated from him, and they were inside the cloud. No indication, I don't think, that they were showing any marks of ultimate glory. As for Ezekiel, carried off Elijah carried off in a chariot, not all of the fathers, but some of the fathers suggest that he was taken to a similar place of natural happiness, has not actually died, did not have separation of soul and body, in other words, because his death is reserved for the last days, and that he, along with Enoch, another one who is said to have walked with God in some kind of paradise after not being seen anymore upon the earth, that these are the two witnesses who will return. That's unanimous among the fathers that speak of it, but it's not an absolutely certain teaching as far as I understand it. But that would be the place where they are, and that pretty much settles, I think, most of the difficulties of texts like that.
Thanks so much, Mike, for the phone call. We'll head quickly to New Orleans, Louisiana. Thomas has been gracious enough to hold on in New Orleans, listening to Catholic Community Radio. Thomas, what's your question for Colin?
God bless you. I listen to Catholic radio quite often, and the concept of beauty is held in high regard.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there are a lot of Catholic works of art that are held in high regard.
Mm-hmm.
Is beauty a moral good, or is it ambiguous?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's the ambiguity in the eye of the beholder, as they say. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But the classical authors, in both pre-Christian and within the church, saw beauty as virtually a transcendental. The things you talk about, the unity of something, one, its oneness in that. That if there is oneness and order and so on, what first strikes, you might say, the studious mind at least, is that this is beautiful. Because it's the nature of a thing that is all in its proper order and reflects the transcendental character of things to be recognized as beautiful by man. Now, subjectively, not all people do. They corrupt their sense of beauty, and so the 20th century and now the 21st, there are some very strange ideas of what is beautiful, especially in art and in music. And so from that point of view, it is subjective. But that there is an objective beauty, this has always been recognized by the classical authors. It wouldn't be a virtue, which is a moral virtue. It's just simply the nature of the things. Or if you have a beautiful painting or a beautiful piece of music, it's that sort of synthesis of all of the notes and sounds and the crescendos and the pianissimos and so on that produce a very orderly expression that strikes us immediately as beautiful, as transcendent, and music is able to compel and lift people up for that reason. But subjectively, some people might find, hard metal or something beautiful, but I think objectively you can't say that. That would be subjectively in a mind that's been conditioned in some way to look for almost for disorder and chaos as sort of the antipode of beauty. And to find that beautiful. So not a moral virtue, but simply a property of things that are properly ordered in expressing their reality in a form which is,
really kind of
attractive,
a byproduct
of the virtue of the
order.
Creator,
right.
Of the person who created it, even.
Well, does that include visual beauty? Because Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:18, as we look not to what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is transitory, but what is unseen is eternal. Do we believe that visual beauty is oneness, part of oneness?
Well, not the oneness of God in this sense is what is more beautiful than the perfect order and simplicity of God. But human beings sometimes produce something which has the touch of divine about it. And sometimes human beings themselves are recognized as, in their physical form, to be beautiful, because after all, we are the image of God, and it's not unlikely that sometimes the body also expresses that in some way. The person morally may not be so beautiful, but at least the physical form can be, and this is also true of art and other things.
Is that where we get the beatific vision from?
The beatific vision is, yes, the satisfaction that will come from seeing God. That joy is the highest kind in the human beauty, and the beauty of art and so on we experience in this world will not compare to it.
Thanks so much, Thomas. We appreciate the phone call. Well, I'm not going to give the phone number out. How am I doing? A special mailbag edition here of EWTN's Open Line Friday, as Colin and I are getting things set up for you at the family celebration at the BJCC as we speak right here in Birmingham, Alabama. We need to get out of here for a minute so I can pull myself together. Open Line Friday with EWTN's Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan.
Welcome to EWTN's Catholic Almanac.
Today is September 16th, the memorial of St. Cornelius, Pope and Martyr, and St. Cyprian, Bishop and Martyr. Together they worked to restore many lapsed Catholics who were forced to abandon the faith to avoid persecution in the 3rd century. Pope Cornelius steadfastly led his flock, with none known to have wavered from their faith even unto death. In honor of our beloved foundress, EWTN has now released a second set of programs commemorating her entrance into eternity. In Memoriam, Mother Mary Angelica, a brand new 4-disc treasury that you'll cherish for years to come. Available now from EWTN Religious Catalog. Relive remarkable memories, heartfelt recollections, and laugh-out-loud anecdotes from friends, family, and even Mother herself.
I believe the network was created by God to teach the person in the living room, the person in the pew, how to live in a nitty-gritty, gutsy world.
Memorable moments from an unforgettable life. Make room on your video shelf today for In Memoriam, Mother Mary Angelica. Special live shows and short programs. Available now at EWTNRC.com. Who brings you the side of the story you won't hear anywhere else? Year after year, it's the National Catholic Register. And here on EWTN Radio, you can get it straight from the news professionals on Register Radio. Every week, you'll hear from the Register's top reporters, bloggers, and experts, as well as in-depth interviews with the newsmakers themselves. Please join us this weekend for Register Radio, Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern and Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern, only on EWTN Radio.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with our Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan. And Colin, we have a question from YouTube. Daniel in Wisconsin wants to know, what prevents the Church, through the magisterium and tradition, to redefine the correct interpretation of the Bible?
Well, it's just never done so. Imagine how difficult that would be, that from beginning...
Well, I would say that the promise of the Holy Spirit prevents the Church from doing that.
Well, it prevents the Church from seeing the necessity of doing it because the Holy Spirit is living and breathing in the Church, and so it can, in one way I have sympathy with that suggestion because, boy, it would certainly clear up a lot of difficulties. But the Church's theological tradition provides the answer to many and solutions to many of the alleged problems that are in Scripture and makes it easier to do. But I think it's also, you could say, the Church herself has the authority to resolve issues as they arise. And it might be, if you thought about it, we have this book and it's got everything in the Bible defined by the Church, and we know infallibly it's this, that, and the other thing. That may actually prove rather limiting, because it would make somebody have what is actually the notion that even some Catholics have, that the Bible is the ultimate authority. God is the ultimate authority. The Bible is written revelation. The sacred tradition is the oral or the teaching revelation. Its elements are discovered or not discovered, but brought out of that tradition and confirmed by the magisterium, expanding it. It's a living thing. And I sort of think of it in this way, that in many respects, the Church has gone through an infancy, a childhood, teenage years, and hopefully, we're moving into the more mature years when we have a better understanding of human nature and all of the everything. The church was never deficient in the means of salvation at any time that she had, but at the same time she didn't claim to know instantaneously as Christ could have if he'd been approached with any question to know necessarily the answer. She got to it by the hard work of theological reflection, the magisterium maybe tolerating and then approving and then advancing and finally declaring a solution as being the one most consistent with the deposit of the faith. And that theological development would not go on. There are some mystics who have suggested that at some point in the future the church might actually do something like that. But they have said it with respect to the era of peace Our Lady promised at Fatima, that when there would be a greater unanimity among people regarding God and faith, and that would almost be then an aside from what the church has to do in evangelization. But I think to now history and providence has provided this other way of coming to the truth in a human way, not simply by an infused knowledge, but by this human process, ultimately culminating in some formal approval by the Supreme Magisterium.
We received a text from James, and this is an interesting question, and I sense that James may fear that he knows the answer to this question already. But he says, I went through RCIA last year but chose not to enter the church. I believe everything that the Catholic Church believes and teaches, but my wife and family are very opposed to my becoming Catholic. My question is it morally wrong for me to remain outside of communion with the church after my conscience has accepted what the church teaches?
The black and white answer is yes. If we know the truth, we're obliged to follow it. But there is a prudential element of how. So we could take the example of the people that the Coming Home Network, the ministers and intellectuals from the Protestant tradition, who manifest an interest in becoming Catholics, but they have considerations of their livelihood, of their families, and this. And so they go at it in a progressive way.
Not to mention the spiritual well-being of their flocks.
Of their flocks and so on. It doesn't prevent an interior adhering to it in view of one's, formal public, but it means disposing and preparing the ground for that. So an argument can be made that what he's saying is acceptable from this point of view, prudentially preparing the ground. But ultimately, push comes to shove, you have to stand up for that which you believe. So I would get with a Catholic priest and go over what practical ways you have to get to that point. And the church recognizes, besides the physical impossibility, is I'm a Christian at the end. I'm somebody at the end of the earth. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Catholic Church. I want to become a Catholic, but there are no Catholics within 5,000 miles. And there's nobody who will baptize me so that I can at least be baptized. Do what the church wants with the mind of the church. That's called moral impossibility, or physical impossibility. There can be moral impossibility too. That the weight of these kinds of consideration locks the person's will to a point where they simply can't bring themselves to do it. Doesn't mean they don't want to do it. Only God can judge that, and that's where the counseling might be good to clarify what's going on in your heart and in your conscience regarding these things. Because we can fool ourselves. On the other hand, we can have not per se emotional, but we can have what we think are reasonable obstacles, which are turned out under examination to be less than reasonable. To get those clarified, I think a good conversation with a wise priest would be a big help.
Skip writes in, I've heard you mention a special wine that could be used by alcoholic priests. Have the rules for that changed in recent years? I served regularly at the altar at our Catholic Student Center when I was in college in the 70s. We had a priest who was severely alcoholic. At communion time, the priest took a sip from the chalice and then handed it to me. It was grape juice. No one else received from the chalice. The real wine went into the cruets. Do you know if grape juice was officially allowed back then in the case of a priest who couldn't tolerate a drop of alcohol? I always enjoy your comments on a variety of subjects tossed at you. You do such a fine job. That's Skip.
Okay. Skip, for the validity of the Eucharist, for the consecration of the wine at least, it must be true wine, which means that fermentation must have started. The Mass would not be valid if that were not the case. It may be, however, that you are misidentifying what's called mustum, which is like the very beginning of fermentation that is then stopped. So that there are molecules of alcohol there, and the Church recognizes it as wine, but they are not at a level that would trigger the alcoholic's reaction. Now, maybe they would, and maybe some people do, and then if that's their experience, then obviously they'd have a big problem. But the Church has allowed the use of mustum, this new wine, if you will, that's just begun fermenting and then stopped. I suspect it might taste a lot like grape juice because it might not have the tingle and the sensations that you would think would accompany consecrated wine. So I don't know that. I've never drank mustum myself, but that is a possibility. If it really were like Welch's off the grocery store shelf, then that's not valid. That can't be consecrated. If it were mustum and simply tasted very much like Welch's off the shelf, then it could be consecrated and be valid.
Very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with our Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. Colin will answer questions about church teaching, theology, scripture, and the like, canon law. Put on your canon lawyer hat today, Colin.
Okay.
EWTN's Open Line Friday rolls on with our Vice President of Theology
Colin Kelly Mast. I cannot even count the number of times that God has clearly shown me His power and love when I continue to say yes to Him. He provides for our needs. Even standing at the funeral home during the wake of my late son, the Holy Spirit kept singing in my head, "The joy of the Lord is my strength." I didn't feel very strong at the time, but I knew that God was holding me close.
Mast Appeal with Colleen Kelly Mast, Saturday, 9 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Podcasts of Open Line are available within 24 hours of live broadcast. Go to EWTN.com and click on Multimedia.
It's time for your favorite EWTN program, but there's no radio? No problem. Download the EWTN app at EWTN.com/mobile and enjoy on-demand live streams of your favorite EWTN radio and TV shows right now.
This is Janet Benkovic, host of Women of Grace.
Hello, this is Cardinal Donald Wuerl of the Archdiocese of Washington.
This is Gloria Purvis, host of Morning Glory. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Sorry about that. I wasn't paying attention. And Colleen Kelly Mast just jumped right in and cut me off.
Yeah,
and that's not the first time she's done that, by the way. But this time it was not her fault. We're taking your email questions today from our Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. Colin is answering those questions as he and I are at the Birmingham Jefferson Convention Complex setting things up for the EWTN Family Celebration. We hope that we will meet you there this weekend right here in Birmingham, Alabama. Josh writes in, Colin, am I still allowed to kneel during Mass even though everyone else doesn't? At our parish, we have no kneelers and everyone stands. I, though, do kneel at the consecration and the Lamb of God and to receive communion. I'm the only one that kneels, and I've been scolded for this by my pastoral minister. So am I still allowed to kneel?
You don't say your pastor, you say pastoral minister, so I'm going to take that as either a sister or a layperson. Actually, the Holy See, through the Congregation for Divine Worship, has basically said to the clergy, you don't scold people for this. The logic is that kneeling is a more reverent posture than, say, standing. This came up in the context of receiving Holy Communion, where there was a time when people were, some Catholics were kneeling down to receive communion, and their priest even would scold them. Their pastor would say, well, you can't do that. The norm for the United States is, we come up in procession and we receive standing. And the congregation said, yes, but the mind of the church is, and the mind of the legislator, this is key. The legislator is not the pastor, not the bishop, not the bishop's conference, not even all the bishops of the world. It's the Pope through the Congregation for Divine Worship. And it's the interpretive mind of the Holy See that you're not restricted in that. And if you go to our EWTN.com, to our website, look on the faith menu, go down to questions and answers, and the frequently asked questions answers. I have done one with the relevant documents from the Holy See on this issue of kneeling for communion, which also has the principles that would cover your other occasions. So, yes, as a general matter, we should adhere to the norms of our country. But I would say that unless your bishop has exercised his option to make standing for the Eucharistic prayer the practice of his diocese, as some bishops along the southern border have done because that's what they do in Mexico, unless he has done that, your pastor would not have the authority to make that the norm for your parish. The fact that he took out the kneelers, or his predecessor, whomever did, would be neither here nor there. You would be free to kneel. In fact, that is the practice. That is the norm for the United States, to kneel during the Eucharistic prayer, to stand up at the doxology, to kneel down again at the Agnus Dei. And a bishop can determine other, but for the whole diocese, it's not a function of the pastor to do that, and he does so invalidly.
Gracie writes in, was recently at my niece's baptism. During the church service, the priest stated that Jesus does not know the name of the children that are not baptized. I found this very disturbing, as the Bible states he knows every hair on our head. Please comment on this and explain what he could have meant by such a comment.
I have no idea.
All right, next email.
Well, there may have been, maybe this was in the, maybe they were muttering the child's name when the priest says, by what name do you wish them called, and who knows what went on there. But
sounds like it may have been a non-Catholic baptism.
It may have been. Maybe one of the churches that claim to have priests that still baptize. In any case, no, it's quite clear that Jesus knows you. Most people receive their name at their birth because the government at least requires it on the birth certificate. It's not like, even if Jesus were not omniscient, knowing everything, that name has already been decided, and the pastor, the baptizing minister is simply, learning it himself for the occasion of the baptism. So I don't know what this minister of baptism meant, but that would be wrong if to be understood directly as put in the question.
Zelia writes in, and I've got a story to tell you after you answer this question. Zelia says, if you count the years that Shem lived, and at what ages his children and their children were born in Genesis, Shem would have still been alive when Abraham was alive. So Melchizedek could have been Shem. And what is more logical than Melchizedek passing his birthright to his youngest living direct male descendant?
That would, in fact, be the opinion of many of the rabbis historically, that Melchizedek was actually Shem. Now,
who was a son of Noah.
A son of Noah. And setting aside the age questions and the longevity questions and so on, the logic would be that from Adam, there would have been the revelation, primitive revelation, given to only primitive because it was at the beginning, that was passed down and maintained, and that monotheism, such as it existed even in corrupted forms in the ancient world, derived from some, from that revelation corrupted. And likewise, the morality and so on that you find in pagan codes and that. The similarity with the Ten Commandments and so on. So, in this view, Shem would have been like a priest of God, would have been the possessor of that knowledge. And this is why by Abraham, he was given the respect that he should. We don't know that that's the case. That's a theory. And there is no necessity that the ages and the succession of individuals in the book of Genesis represents a generation by generation account. We already know that doesn't apply in the book of Matthew, where in order to get to the 12 generations between Abraham and David and the Christ and so on, it's sort of compressed a little bit for the point of the numerics there that was trying to be given as a representation of Jesus' paternity there. So you have the longevity question. You have the question of how many generations are really involved there. It's a nice theory. I like the theory, but the church doesn't affirm things like that, and is whatever scholars might say.
There was a mass when I lived in Des Moines. There was a parish that had a 6 a.m. mass that had a pretty good little crowd at it. There was a Monsignor at that parish that had been there for quite a while, and the parochial vicar at the parish was a wonderful Dominican father, and I'll leave all the names out of this story so as to protect the innocent or not so innocent. And there was a gentleman who frequented that mass that I would see quite frequently, who was a very prominent businessman, and we'll call him Tom. His name was not Tom. And he would be at that mass frequently, and he had undergone a radical conversion experience upon the death of his father, and had really drawn close to his Catholic faith, the faith of his youth. And the reading for the day at a particular daily mass was the reading about Melchizedek. And the Dominican father who gave the homily at the mass explained the various theories that had been laid out over the years as to who Melchizedek was, and settled on the notion that Melchizedek was merely a prefigurement of Christ. So as we're leaving Mass, I feel a hand on my shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Tom, and he leans up into my ear, and he says, "I don't care what he says, it's Shem." So I later conveyed that story to the priest, and the priest had a very distinctive way of talking, and he said, "Well, Jack, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Tom, and anyone who has seen the transformation in his life since his father's passing can be nothing but inspired by the works that have come out of him in those years. But as you can see, he's clearly serving the devil." So
I think they're both hardened in their opinions.
There's no question about that. We've got a text from Donna, and she asks, why are things like Alpha to Omega not translated to English in the Bible?
I think because, remember, in the first century world, the Septuagint was used. It was the Greek translation of the Jewish fathers in Alexandria, was used for the Old Testament. And the New Testament was written in Greek. And Alpha and Omega, clearly to Greek speakers and those who read it, know that those are the first and the last, which is also said, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. So you get multiple versions of first and last, iterations of first and last there. And I think it's just, it's very expressive. We don't give names to our letters of the alphabet. We might say from A to Z, and people would know where. But that's nowhere as attractive a form as Alpha to the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus saying, "I am the beginning and the end." So I think it's very expressive, and like Amen and some other words that are carried over and not translated in the Bible from out of their original language. It's simply been kept because they are very expressive.
And we've got an email it's actually a text from Dennis. He says, I attended RCIA but did not attend the Easter Vigil because of my past marriage. I applied for a declaration of nullity, but it's not final. Can I go to confession but not partake in communion? I would like to confess some mortal sins.
Well, before you're received into the church, you would have to go to confession. You're an adult. You've presumably had some sinning. And most adults have. Likelihood of mortal sin is actually probably quite high in most adults. So you would have to do that. I think in view of that circumstance, there might be some, so even though you're technically not a Catholic yet, there might be some grounds in canon law for serious reasons. I believe it's Canon 848, paragraph 4, if I'm not mistaken, where it talks about the grounds in which non-Catholics can receive the sacraments. In this case, the sacrament, it would be in view of your reception into the church. That might not be pastoral acceptable. I don't really know what the practice is.
In most RCIA programs, I think that the candidates go through First Communion several weeks before they actually go through Easter Vigil.
Right, but in proximity to their baptism, rather than being allowed to go to confession repeatedly, during that time.
Now, would he being a catechumen or a candidate make a difference?
I think it would. I think that helps the argument that if you are expected to have a wait of a year, you have a serious reason for your spiritual well-being to go to confession now, rather than waiting till that annulment. Ask the question. It never hurts to ask. The answer might be no, but it might also be yes.
Here you go. You got a text from Mike. You got 90 seconds, Colin. What can be said of those who interpret the Bible on their own?
Well, if they're interpreting it to see, wow, I don't live up to that, there's nothing wrong with that. If they're interpreting it against the mind of the tradition and specifically against the mind of the magisterium, there's a lot wrong with that. St. Peter tells us that the dangers of private interpretation. You get locked up in your own mental condition. You think you understand all the principles and applying them correctly when you don't. The church doesn't work that way. She gets to conclusions, as we discussed earlier, after a long period of reflection and after multiple agreements, really, in the tradition and finally by a pope. So we're very careful. We love our own opinions, and that's the danger of private interpretation.
Colin, thanks for bilocating today.
You're welcome, and you as well.
Back at it again Monday. John Martinoni will be in the house talking scriptural apologetics. Barbara McGuigan back here on Tuesday. We'll talk to Father Mitch on Wednesday, Father Larry on Thursday, back with Colin next Friday. On behalf of our host, Colin Donovan, producer Elena Rodriguez, and our non-existent call screener, I'm Jack Williams. Thanking you for tuning into this special mailbag edition of Open Line Friday. Till we get together Monday, God bless.